I pulled up to the summit just after 6:30 p.m. The building looked like something out of a Christmas card, the lights twinkling off the snow, all warm and inviting. But I wasn't feeling any of that. I'd never been good at blending in, especially not here. My jacket was worn, my car nothing more than a basic sedan. Everything about me screamed out of place next to the polished, shiny world of the country club. I could see my family waiting near the entrance, already gathered, looking like a picture from some high society magazine. My dad, James, was in a suit that probably cost more than my rent, and he looked every bit the part of a man who belonged here. The way he stood, the way his posture was so perfect, like he was waiting for someone to hand him a trophy. "You're late," he said when I walked up, not even bothering with a hug. I felt the cold bite of his gaze as he added, "This event is exclusive to members only." I didn't understand. I'd been invited. I'd been looking forward to this dinner. Why was this just coming up now? I tried to say something, anything, to smooth things over, but he cut me off. "You're not a member, Tom, so no, not tonight." Alex and Katie were standing a few feet away, looking uncomfortable, like they didn't know whether to speak up or just fade into the background. It was one of those moments where everyone's waiting for you to make a move, but I didn't have a move to make. I was caught, stranded in a world I didn't belong to. Not even on Christmas Eve. I hesitated, but my father didn't. He turned his back on me, leading Alex and Katie inside, leaving me standing there in the snow. I'd been looking forward to tonight, but now it felt like I was just in the way. And then, out of nowhere, someone stepped out of the building, someone I never expected to see. I turned on my heel, ready to just get in my car and drive away. I could feel the cold creeping in, but that was nothing compared to the tight, heavy knot in my chest. The crunch of snow under my boots felt like the only sound in the world. Then, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Tom!" It was Richard, the club's director. He was out of breath, his cheeks flushed, like he'd been running to catch up with me. He grabbed my arm before I could even take another step. "Why are you leaving?" he asked, looking genuinely confused. I opened my mouth to answer, but the words got stuck. How could I explain the mess my family had created in one sentence? How could I explain the way my father's gaze had sliced through me, like I was the thing ruining their perfect night? I took a breath, finally managing to say, "They said I'm not a member. They don't want me here." Richard's face shifted, like he was piecing things together in real time. Confusion turned to disbelief. He glanced at the entrance, where my family still stood, frozen in their polished little bubble. Without saying a word to me, Richard turned and strode toward them, the air between us thick now, like the weight of the truth was about to crush me. I didn't know what he was going to do, but I couldn't look away. I stayed where I was, tension running through every part of me as I watched him approach my father. "James," Richard said, his voice loud enough for me to hear from where I stood. "This is Tom's club." I blinked, the words taking a second to sink in. Richard wasn't finished. "Tom owns the summit," he continued, his voice ringing with authority. My father's face turned ashen. Alex and Katie exchanged these wide-eyed looks, their silence suddenly deafening. My dad sputtered, his usual composure cracking, but Richard wasn't done. He stood taller now, his presence filling the space. "Tom is the sole owner of this club," Richard said, each word cutting through the air like a knife. "You're standing in his home." I couldn't see their faces, but I could hear the murmurs, the sharp intake of breath. The people standing near the entrance, the ones who'd been quietly watching, started whispering amongst themselves. I'd never imagined this moment would come. Not like this, not in front of them, but there it was, the truth laid bare. My family was stunned into silence. My father, prideful, always so sure of himself, looked lost, like he'd suddenly been thrust into a world he didn't recognize. Alex, his jaw tight, shifted uncomfortably, but he stayed silent. Katie seemed to shrink even further into herself, her gaze flicking from me to my parents like she was trying to find somewhere to hide. I felt a rush of pride, but also something else, something deeper, more complicated. Vindication, maybe, but it didn't feel as sweet as I thought it would. Instead, it was a bitter kind of clarity, a reminder of just how far apart we drifted. Richard finally turned back to me, the moment dragging on like slow motion. His eyes held mine for a second, and then he gave a subtle nod, like he was offering me a chance to step forward, but I couldn't. Not yet. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, and even though I'd won in that moment, I couldn't ignore the knot of anger and resentment tightening in my chest. The silence was thick enough to choke on. My father's face had gone an uncomfortable shade of red, like he was trying to force the words he needed to save face. He cleared his throat and said, This is all just a misunderstanding. We were confused, Tom. He didn't meet my eyes. His gaze was fixed on the floor, then to Richard, then anywhere but me. It was clear he was trying to downplay it, to make it seem like it wasn't a big deal, but it was a big deal, and I wasn't about to let him sweep it under the rug. I stood there, still, my arms folded across my chest. I wasn't going to let them off that easy. Not tonight. Not after everything. Alex, trying to break the tension, stepped forward, his voice soft. Hey man, we're just trying to figure this out. We were thinking, maybe you could still join us for dinner? I wanted to snap at him, tell him how badly he'd misjudged the situation, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed quiet. It wasn't about dinner anymore. It was about respect. They didn't get it, and no half-hearted offer of food would fix that. My mom, ever the perfectionist, leaned in slightly, her voice tight with discomfort. Tom, we didn't mean for it to be like this. Can you forgive us? Her words sounded hollow. Her eyes flicked over me, taking in the worn jacket I was wearing, the quiet way I stood away from them, and I could almost hear the judgment in her silence. You know, she added almost offhandedly, you really should think about upgrading your lifestyle. This modesty thing, it's not working for you. The words hit harder than I expected. Her tone wasn't cruel, but it stung just the same. It was a criticism I'd heard all my life, and one I couldn't pretend to ignore. I had money, I had power, but I had never fit into their world, and I sure as hell didn't need them telling me what I was doing wrong. I shook my head, feeling the disgust rise in my chest. I didn't owe them anything, least of all an explanation. Dad spoke again, his voice now a little shaky. Look, Tom, we're sorry. Let's just forget this and move on. We can make things right, son. You know we can. The words had a weight to them, but not the kind that would bring any closure. Not to me. Not tonight. The sting of their actions wasn't something I could just erase. He didn't get it. They all didn't get it. And I was done waiting for them to see what they had done. I've made my decision, I said, my voice low but firm. It's not about the dinner. It's about respect. They were still trying to fix it. But I knew then that there was nothing they could do to make this right. Not now. Not after everything. I stepped through the doors, feeling every eye in the room flick to me, then away just as quickly. The whispers didn't sting like I thought they would. This time, it wasn't pity. It was respect. I could feel it in the way people watched me, like they were suddenly aware of who I really was. Richard was already sitting at the main table, a glass of wine in hand, talking to a couple of other entrepreneurs I'd worked with over the years. He caught sight of me and waved me over with a grin, like we were old friends, which I guess we were. I made my way toward the table, and that's when I saw them. My family was seated across the room, in their usual little bubble. My dad was trying to play the role of the charming, powerful man he thought everyone admired, talking to a few guests like he was the king of the castle. But I could see it in their faces. People weren't impressed. They were confused, disappointed even. I felt a flash of satisfaction. Watching him fail at something he did so effortlessly for years, it didn't feel as good as I expected. It was more like watching a house of cards finally collapse after being on the verge of it for so long. Katie, Alex's wife, kept glancing at me from across the room. I could see the embarrassment in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her discomfort was obvious. I took a seat next to Richard, and just as I did, a few familiar faces walked over to greet me. People I'd worked with, people who knew exactly who I was. They knew my role in the summit. I wasn't just another guy in the crowd. I was Tom, the owner of the club they all admired from a distance. Good to see you, Tom, one of them said, a local business mogul who'd been trying to get a deal with me for a while. Congratulations on everything. You've really made something of this place. Thanks, I said, nodding, but it felt like a distant, hollow kind of thanks. I glanced over at my family again. My dad was still talking, but his words seemed to hit a little too hard, a little too awkward. The people he was trying to impress weren't buying what he was selling. They knew who he was, and now they knew who I was. As I sipped my wine, I could see them trying to blend in, putting on their best faces, but the cracks were too wide. It was impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a message from Richard or a few others I was working with. But it was from Alex. Tom, I'm sorry. Please let's talk. This isn't what I wanted. I stared at the message for a moment, the words landing with a strange weight. I had nothing to say to him. We need to fix this. The second message was almost an echo of the first, a quiet plea that made me feel nothing. He was trying, but the damage had already been done. They'd made their choice. They'd chosen their side, and now they had to live with it. I didn't owe them anything anymore. I tucked my phone back into my pocket and leaned back in my chair, feeling the tension in my chest start to loosen. The people around me were talking about business, about life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Alex kept texting, though. The phone kept buzzing on the table, and each new message from him made me more sure of one thing. No apology, no regret, no attempt to fix things would ever be enough. They didn't get it, and I didn't have the energy to make them understand. Dinner finally started, and I took my seat at the table, the one Richard had arranged for me. A couple I knew, Steve and Linda, were already there. They had been friends of mine for years, long before I owned the summit. They were easy to talk to, grounded, and refreshingly normal in a world full of people trying to look perfect. "Tom, it's good to see you," Linda said, her warm smile making me feel like I belonged. "We've been hearing nothing but great things about your charity work lately. You really made a difference with that food drive last month." "Thanks," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "It's just something that needed to be done. Not that hard when you've got the right people backing you," Steve chimed in. "You've always been a community guy, Tom. We admire that about you. Not everyone remembers where they came from once they get a taste of the good life." Their words felt genuine, and I couldn't help but appreciate the shift in atmosphere. This wasn't the cold, calculating world of my family. This was real. As we chatted, I caught sight of my family across the room. They were still at their table, trying to make it look like everything was fine. My dad was telling a story, gesturing with his hands, but it didn't seem like anyone was really listening. The people around them wore polite smiles, but their eyes kept flicking toward my table. I noticed the subtle glances they were sending me, almost like they were trying to figure out what had happened to the guy they thought they knew. I smiled to myself, the wine in my glass suddenly tasting sweeter. Alex, looking like a deer caught in headlights, finally stood up from his table and made his way over to mine. He looked hesitant, like he wasn't sure whether to be pissed off or apologetic. He opened his mouth, probably to say something about family and needing to all be together, but the words didn't make it out. He cleared his throat and gave me a stiff smile. "Hey, Dad, he wanted me to ask if you'd join us. He said it's not too late for you to sit with us." I glanced at my family, still a few feet away, watching me like I was some kind of exhibit. I felt a wave of irritation rise in my chest, but I kept it calm, kept it light. "No thanks, Alex," I said, giving him a tight smile. "I'm good here." I didn't need to look at my dad to know he was watching. I felt his eyes burning into the back of my neck. He probably wanted to come over and give me some half-baked speech about keeping up appearances or doing the right thing, but it wasn't happening. Not tonight. Linda, sensing the shift, leaned in and asked, "So, how's that outreach project you've been working on with the kids? We saw some of your photos on social media." "It's amazing what you're doing." I looked back at my family across the room. Their faces were tight, stiff with discomfort, and I could almost hear their silent judgment. Alex and Katie exchanged a glance, one that said everything without needing words. I had no doubt they were realizing the consequences of their actions. They were finally seeing the divide, and it was wider than they'd ever imagined. I kept the conversation flowing with Steve and Linda, enjoying their company, but all the while, I couldn't stop watching my family. My dad kept talking to people who weren't really listening, and Katie kept glancing at me from across the room. There was no escaping it. They had lost the battle without even knowing it. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket again. This time, it was Alex. "We need to talk. Please, come back to the table. This isn't right." I didn't even bother to look at the next message. The damage was done, and nothing he could say would change it. A few more people came over to our table, and the conversation shifted to business. I was comfortable in my seat, surrounded by people who respected me, people who didn't see me as a failure because I didn't wear a suit every day or talk like I had everything figured out. The contrast was enough to make the tension in my chest loosen a little more. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I saw Alex standing at the edge of the room, watching me. He looked like he was about to say something, maybe an apology, maybe an excuse, but I just smiled and shook my head. "I'm fine. I said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. He didn't move, didn't respond. He just stood there, frozen, as if waiting for me to change my mind. But I didn't. As dessert was served, I settled back into my chair, savoring the bite of chocolate cake. The room was buzzing with quiet conversation, but my mind kept drifting back to my family, still seated across the room, their discomfort palpable. I didn't know what they expected from me, but I wasn't about to give them anything. Just as I was finishing my wine, the server approached me, a small slip of paper in his hand. He leaned down and quietly placed it on the table. "Message from the front desk, sir." I unfolded the paper, expecting to see some routine note, but instead, it was the bill for my family's meal, the one they hadn't asked for. I didn't even need to look at the total to know what was coming. The price was going to be steep, and I could already see my father's face when he realized what had happened. Sure enough, just a few minutes later, I saw the server approach my family's table, bill in hand. My dad's eyes narrowed as he scanned it, then went wide with disbelief. "This is absurd," he said, voice rising. "Where's the discount? You can't just charge us full price." I could hear the tension in his voice, the sharpness of someone desperately trying to cling to the little bit of dignity left. But there was no more room for bargaining. The server remained calm and professional, unfazed by my father's outburst. "Sir, I'm sorry, but there's no record of your membership in good standing tonight." I watched the color drain from my dad's face as he fumbled for words. There was nothing left to say. Alex, who had been nervously watching from the sidelines, walked over to me, his face pinched with anxiety. "Tom," he said quietly, leaning down to my level, "can you reconsider? Just come back to the table with us. This isn't how it's supposed to be." I shook my head slowly, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours. "No, Alex, it's not about dinner anymore. It's about everything else." I didn't need to explain. He'd heard me. He had to have. I looked over at Richard, who had been observing the scene from a distance, his arms folded across his chest. I caught his eye, and with a subtle nod, he walked over. "Richard," I said quietly, "can you make sure the bill reflects what it would have been if they were in good standing?" He nodded without a word, stepping to the side to handle it. I didn't have to watch the rest of it unfold. The damage was done. I turned my attention back to my table, but my mind was on the scene across the room. My parents were arguing, and it wasn't about food or money anymore. It was about respect. Their actions had cost them more than they realized, and now they had to pay. A few minutes later, I saw my father hand over the credit card, his movements slow and stiff. The server took it, processed the payment, and returned with a receipt. There was no protest, no further back and forth. They knew exactly what they'd lost. When my family stood to leave, the mood in the room was like a heavy weight pressing down on everyone. My parents walked out with their heads down, shoulders hunched, the air between them thick with embarrassment. As they exited, Richard came over to me, his face serious. "Don't worry, Tom. This will be documented. The club's management is already handling it. They won't be walking out of here the same way again." I nodded. There was nothing more to say. The rules had been set, and they'd crossed them. I couldn't change that, and I wasn't about to try. There was no going back from here. They knew exactly what their actions had cost them. As I made my way toward the door, the weight of the night hung heavy on my shoulders. I wasn't sure what I expected when I got here, but it sure as hell wasn't this. The cold air hit me as soon as I stepped outside, sharp and biting, like the world was reminding me that I was done with pretending. Just as I was about to walk to my car, I saw Richard and Charles approach me. Charles, the club's senior manager, looked even more serious than usual. Both of them stopped in front of me, their expressions unreadable. "Tom," Richard said, his voice a little lower now, like we were moving into official territory, "we need to discuss your family's future with the club." I didn't say anything at first, just waited. I knew what was coming. Charles spoke next, his tone careful but firm. "We understand your decision tonight, but we need clarity moving forward. What do you want to do about their membership?" I could feel the question hanging there, waiting for me to crack, to back down. But I wasn't going to, not anymore. "They can stay," I said, my voice steady. "For now, but any future issues, any more problems, immediate revocation. They'll be gone just as fast as they came in." Richard and Charles exchanged a glance, and I could see the understanding pass between them. Charles nodded. "That's fair. Their behavior tonight was unacceptable. It will be reviewed, and if there's any more trouble..." He trailed off, letting the implication hang. I didn't need to hear more. I was done explaining myself. done bending to their expectations. My family had made their choice, and now they had to live with the consequences. They walked off after that, leaving me standing alone in the cold night, the weight of everything settling into my bones. I turned and walked back to my car, feeling like I was moving through the last chapter of a book I never thought I'd finish. When I got inside, I sat there for a minute, just letting the silence fill the space around me. I pulled out my phone and typed a quick message to my father, the words coming to me before I even had to think about it. The club has its rules, so do I. I hit send and leaned back in the seat, staring out at the night. I was done trying to be the person they wanted me to be. This was who I was now, and nothing they could say or do would change that. The world might think they won tonight, but when the dust settled, they'd know it was me who had the last word.